I thought we could switch it up a bit for this next video. With the Hunt for Gollum movie in production as of the time of this video coming out, and me being a massive Lord of the Rings fan, it really seemed like the perfect opportunity to talk about that period of time in Middle-earth. If you've seen the films, which I'm sure many of you have, either theatrical or the extended cut, it kind of feels, at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf kind of just disappears for a couple of days or months. He rides to Gondor, Minas Tirith, before returning to the Shire in what, according to the cut of the movie, implies around about a week, maybe a month or two. And we get that with movies. We can understand that there's only so much time and budget, I suppose, for what is included in the final cut. But if we look at what Tolkien wrote, there's quite a lot of good stuff that happens in that time, and it's something I wanted to talk about, really. If we were to look at the words that Tolkien himself wrote in The Fellowship of the Ring, between Bilbo's farewell party and Frodo leaving Bag End with Samwise Gamgee, that's about 17 years that passed by. And in those 17 years, in which Gandalf quietly pieces together a mystery that could determine the fate of Middle-earth, Aragorn is involved long before becoming king. He undertakes one of the greatest hunts of his life, and in those 17 years, there is one miserable broken creature who unknowingly becomes the most wanted being in the world at that point in time. Of course, the creature I speak of is none other than Gollum. With the new film exploring this forgotten chapter, it kind of feels like the perfect time to revisit that story that's only ever hinted at. It's never truly explored. We know very little about that period of time in Middle-earth. So, while Frodo was living a quiet life in the Shire, believing the world beyond its borders had little to do with him, some of Middle-earth's greatest figures were desperately trying to answer a single question. Who or what had Bilbo really found beneath the misty mountains? To understand why Gollum became so important, we first need to go back to the end of The Hobbit. When Bilbo returned home from his adventure with Thorin and the company of dwarves, he brought back a treasure that the likes of the hobbits in Bag End has never seen. Bilbo's haul never made a dent in the mountains of riches hidden away in Erebor. Despite the gold, despite the garment made of the most indestructible material, mithril, Bilbo carried home with him a treasure most dear and more valuable than any treasure trove on Middle-earth. A plain golden ring. To Bilbo, it was simply a lucky trinket. It had helped him escape goblins, outwit dangerous creatures, and survive situations that should have been impossible. It granted invisibility, and although that was kind of unusual, Middle-earth was filled with magical objects. On its own, there was very little reason to believe this ring was unique. Even Gandalf, who had accompanied Bilbo on his journey, had no immediate reason to suspect otherwise. But the ring behaved kind of strangely, you see, and Bilbo seemed unusually attached to it. Magical rings were not unheard of, and there was no obvious reason to assume this simple band of gold was the one ring forged by Sauron himself, or, more accurately, Celebrimbor. As the years passed, however, Gandalf began to notice just the small things. Bilbo himself hardly seemed to age. His affection for the ring grew stronger. Wherever the subject arose, he became strangely defensive, almost possessive. What might once have seemed like harmless eccentricity slowly began to resemble something darker. The ring was beginning to influence its bearer. The ring was quietly manipulating Bilbo, seducing his mind and making the admiration or desire for the ring unbreakable. A growing reluctance to ever let the ring go festered in Bilbo for many years. For Gandalf, that was enough to raise uncomfortable questions. Where had this ring really come from? And perhaps more importantly, who had Bilbo taken it from, and were they going to come looking for it? That answer lay with a creature almost everyone else had forgotten. Deep beneath the misty mountains had lived a twisted being who once belonged to a people not unlike hobbits themselves. Over centuries, his mind and body had been warped by the influence of the ring, until almost nothing remained of the person he had once been. Gollum, originally named Smeagol, was a Stoor, one of the 3 early Hobbit types in the Third Age. By possessing the One Ring, his life extended centuries beyond his nature, and he became deformed and twisted in body and mind by the corruption of the ring. When Bilbo escaped beneath the mountains, Gollum lost more than a precious possession. He lost the centre of his entire existence, his very reason for breathing. For centuries, the ring had been his only companion. It had consumed every thought, every desire, every memory of the life he had once lived. Without it, he was once again left with a single obsession: finding it again. And so, when Bilbo settled comfortably back into the peaceful hills of the Shire, another journey quietly began. One that would eventually draw the attention of Gandalf, Aragorn, the servants of Sauron, and ultimately the Dark Lord himself. Because Gollum wasn't the only one searching, and somewhere beyond the mountains, another shadow had begun to stir. The years passed quietly, or at least they appeared to. Life in the Shire carried on much as it always had. Seasons came and went, birthdays were celebrated, gardens were tended, ales were drank, and Bilbo Baggins continued to enjoy the comfortable life he had fought so hard to return to after his adventure. If you were standing in Hobbiton during those years, you would never suspect that the fate of Middle-earth was slowly beginning to shift. But Gandalf couldn't shake a growing feeling that something wasn't quite right. Hobbits were known for living long lives, sure, but Bilbo seemed almost untouched by the passing years. Friends who had once been his equals were beginning to show their age, while Bilbo appeared remarkably unchanged. It was subtle enough that most people dismissed it, but to Gandalf, it echoed old stories he had spent centuries studying, stories about rings of power. Now, it is worth remembering that at this point, the One Ring had been lost for thousands of years. Most believed it had passed forever out of history. The last known account placed it in the hands of Isildur, who cut it from the hand of the Dark Lord Sauron himself at the end of the Second Age. But Isildur never returned home. He was ambushed on the road and slain, and the ring vanished into the waters of the River Anduin. Generations came and went, kingdoms rose and fell, and the ring simply disappeared, lost in time. Without any trace of it, many assumed it had been lost forever. Even Gandalf hoped that was true, because if Bilbo's ring really was the One Ring, then that could mean only one thing: Sauron would never stop searching for it. But Gandalf needed proof. So, over many years, he began gathering fragments of history from every source he could find. Ancient records, forgotten scrolls, conversations with those who still remembered the old days. Each offered another small piece of an impossibly large puzzle. You'll note it's here where it's shown in Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf in Minas Tirith, making use of their libraries and their texts and their scrolls of history. And it's here where he retraced the ring's known history. He studied the ancient lore surrounding the rings of power, and little by little, a terrifying possibility emerged. If the ring had survived, how had it found its way beneath the misty mountains? The answer could only lie with the one creature Bilbo had encountered all those years before: Gollum. But finding Gollum would prove far easier said than done. After losing the ring, Gollum abandoned the darkness beneath the misty mountains. For centuries, those endless tunnels had been his entire world. They had hidden him from sunlight, from civilization, and from almost everyone who might have remembered what he once was. Now, for the first time in generations, he stepped back into the light of Middle-earth, and he had only one purpose: finding his precious. His search carried him far beyond the mountains. He followed rumours, scents, distant memories, anything that might lead him back to the ring. He knew nothing of Bilbo's home, only that a Baggins had stolen what belonged to him. It was a desperate search, driven entirely by obsession, and that obsession slowly carried him south, closer and closer to Mordor. Meanwhile, far in the southern lands, another power was awakening. Although many still spoke of Sauron as though he were a threat from ancient history, The Dark Lord had never truly been defeated. His physical form had been destroyed, but his will endured. Hidden in the shadows, he had spent centuries rebuilding his strength, gathering servants, and preparing for the day he would reveal himself once more. By this point, that day was rapidly approaching. His fortress in Mordor had been reclaimed. The fires of Mount Doom burned once again. The Nazgul, his most feared servants, who had once been men, had returned. And although Sauron did not yet know where the One Ring was, he knew enough to understand one simple truth. It was still out there, waiting to be found. What neither Gandalf nor Sauron realised was that they were now searching for the same individual. One sought Gollum to uncover the truth, the other sought him to recover his ring. Middle-earth had become the stage for a race neither side fully understood just yet, and somewhere between them wandered a lonely, broken creature, unaware that his every step was drawing the attention of the two greatest powers left in the world. For years, Gandalf searched for answers as to the whereabouts of Gollum's location, but answers are difficult to find in the world as old as Middle-earth. Ancient kingdoms had fallen into ruin, libraries had been lost to fire and war. Those few who still remembered the elder days were scattered across the world, and even their memories had begun to fade with time. The wizard had begun to suspect the truth, and there was only one way he could confirm his suspicions. He needed to find Gollum, something that was easier said than done. Imagine trying to track a single individual across the entire continent of Middle-earth. Only scattered rumours carried by frightened travellers. A strange creature seen slipping through the reeds at dusk, missing livestock, whispers of glowing eyes in the darkness. Most dismissed these stories as nothing more than tales told around campfires. But Gandalf knew better. Somewhere behind those rumours was a trail. He simply needed someone capable of following it. That someone was the Ranger, Strider, better known as Aragorn. Long before he wore the crown or stood before the Black Gate, drawing the gaze of the Eye of Sauron, Aragorn was simply known as a Ranger of the North. To most people, Rangers were little more than mysterious wanderers, weathered travellers who appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. Few understood what they truly did, while the kingdoms of men slowly forgot the dangers that still lurked beyond their borders. The Rangers remained watchful. They guarded roads that others believed were safe. They hunted creatures most people never even knew existed. They stood between ordinary folk and threats they would never see. It was quiet work. Honest, often thankless, always dangerous, and among them, Aragorn had earned a reputation unlike any other. He knew the wilderness better than almost anyone alive. He could read broken branches as though they were written words, a footprint pressed into soft earth, a disturbed patch of moss, even the absence of birdsong. Details most would overlook became clues beneath his careful eye. If anyone could find Gollum, it was definitely him. Together, Gandalf and Aragorn began what would become one of the longest and most difficult searches in the history of Middle-earth. Across forests, rivers, mountains and marshes, Aragorn followed every lead he could. Sometimes the trail seemed promising, only to disappear without warning. Other times he arrived just days or even hours too late, discovering only the signs that Gollum had already moved on. It must have felt like chasing a ghost sometimes. Gollum belonged nowhere. He built no home, trusted no one, travelled always alone, driven by a single obsession that refused to let him rest. Gollum would search endlessly for Baggins, though he had little idea who Baggins even was or where he might be found. What Gollum didn't realise was that his desperate search was slowly drawing him into the path of far greater powers. But eventually, the years of patient tracking by Aragorn paid off. He had finally found him. After following Gollum's trail across much of the wilderness, Aragorn finally captured the exhausted creature in the desolate lands known as the Dead Marshes, a place already steeped in the memory of ancient battles. It's worth remembering that Gollum had survived alone in the wild for centuries. He was incredibly wary, quick, and surprisingly difficult to catch. Aragorn later described him as being slippery, and exhausting to pursue, and after searching for so long, you can almost imagine the relief of finally bringing the hunt to an end. But the journey didn't quite stop there. Aragorn and Gollum would travel north, and Gollum constantly fought to escape. According to Aragorn himself, he had to keep Gollum bound, yet even then he couldn't treat him carelessly. Gollum was exhausted, terrified, and forever looking for an opportunity to escape, often biting Aragorn's hands in his attempt. Aragorn says that when they reached Mirkwood, Gollum looked up at the trees and seemed almost overcome. After so many years wandering through barren lands, forests, marshes and mountains, simply seeing the great woodland again seemed to stir something in him. For a brief moment, he wasn't thinking about escaping or his precious. He was simply looking at the beauty of the trees. It's a very small, tiny moment, but it's very powerful, and it's one of the few reminders that somewhere beneath that twisted creature, there was still a little trace of Smeagol. When Aragorn did hand him over to the elves of Mirkwood, his part in the hunt was complete. When Gandalf meets him under the guard of the elves in northern Mirkwood, he's not looking at a monster in the way most people imagine. He's looking at someone who's been completely destroyed by the ring. It is easy to forget that Gollum wasn't always Gollum. Over time, Gandalf begins questioning him, trying to understand exactly how the ring came into his possession and what happened after Bilbo escaped from the goblin tunnels. And as Gollum tells his story, everything starts falling into place. The ring Bilbo found hadn't just been lying beneath the mountains by chance. It had a history stretching back thousands of years, all the way to Isildur after the fall of Sauron. Somehow, against all odds, it had passed through history unnoticed before ending up in Gollum's hands after killing his friend Deagle in cold blood one morning while they were fishing, and then eventually landing in Bilbo's hands. But while Gandalf is finally getting answers, there's another part of Gollum's story that makes the situation far more dangerous. At some point, after leaving the Misty Mountains, and before Aragorn found him, Gollum wanders further south than he ever should have. Eventually, he reached the borders of Mordor. Gollum is captured by Sauron's servants and taken into the Dark Lord's realm. Tolkien never goes into graphic detail about what happened there, but we'd know enough to understand the outcome. Sauron interrogates him and tortures Gollum. The results of said torture scattered across his back. Sauron was determined to learn anything he could about the ring that escaped him thousands of years earlier. The trouble is, Gollum doesn't actually know where the ring is. He doesn't even know where the Shire is, and he doesn't know who Bilbo really is either. But he remembers those two words from his time playing riddles in the dark: Baggins and Shire. To Gollum, they're fragments of memory, the last clues left behind by the thief who stole his precious. But to Sauron, they're the first real lead he's had in 1,000 years. For all this time, the ring had effectively disappeared from history. Nobody knew where it was. As far as Sauron was concerned, it could have been lying at the bottom of a river forever. Now, out of nowhere, he suddenly has a name and a place. Now, Gandalf realizes he is racing against the Dark Lord himself, because if Sauron reaches the ring before the Free Peoples realize what they have, the consequences are almost unimaginable. Every decision matters now. Every delay gives Sauron more time, and while Gandalf is trying to work out what to do next, the Dark Lord has already begun moving his pieces into position. The Nazgul are gathering. The search for the Shire has begun, and without knowing it, Frodo Baggins is about to become the most important person in Middle-earth. Now at this point, Gollum stays in Mirkwood under the watchful eyes of the elves. What's interesting is that they don't throw him into a dungeon and forget about him. He is guarded, yes, but they also let him spend time outside. He climbs trees, wanders around under watch, and for the first time in centuries, he's living somewhere that isn't a cave beneath a mountain. Unfortunately, things don't stay quiet for too long though. While Gollum is still being held there, orcs attack Mirkwood. During all the confusion, Gollum seizes the chance, and he escapes. When Gandalf first started looking for Gollum, he was the missing piece of the puzzle. Now that the puzzle is complete, Gandalf knows what Bilbo's ring really is, and Sauron knows the words Shire and Baggins. With this context of the story of Gollum, Aragorn and Gandalf over the 17 years during the Fellowship of the Ring, we now understand Gandalf's urgency upon his return to Frodo in the Shire. Behind the scenes, he spent years chasing rumours, digging through ancient records, and working with Aragorn to find the one creature who might know the truth. And if Gandalf and Aragorn hadn't solved it when they did, the story could have gone very differently. Sauron would have been looking for the ring while the three people still had no idea where it was. Frodo would have inherited it without anyone understanding what it actually was. The Council of Elrond might never have happened, and the Fellowship might never have been formed. And in the end, that's why I'm really excited to see The Hunt for Gollum on the big screen.